good afternoon. Buenas tardes on this Tuesday. It's kind of a warm Tuesday here in the East San Fernando Valley. We're here at Tia Chucha's in Silmar, and we're very thankful for them hosting this book talk for Natalia Molina's latest book, which is A Place at the Nayarit. A place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community, which came out in UC Press this 2022. It is really quite my honor to be in conversation with Natalia today. She's one of my mentors from grad school, and I learned tremendously from her. And also I saw this book come to fruition in many very fruitful and long sessions of writing that where a lot of the ideas were thought about, and also as we saw them being created as they came in, and that definitely also helped out my work as a scholar. So I want to introduce Dr. Molina to you all today. Professor Molina is a distinguished scholar and distinguished professor at the American Studies and Ethnicity Department at the University of Southern California. In addition, she's a 2020 MacArthur Fellow. This highlights and recognizes all the work that she has done in helping us think broadly about relational concepts of race and how race is created in the US and beyond. Natalia is also the author of two award-winning books before the Place at the Nayarit. One, How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and that's the first one. And then, the first one is Fit to be Citizens. I blanked out on that one, which came out in 2006. And then the second one, that, if I'm not mistaken, was published in 2013. That is How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts. We're here today to talk about A Place at the Nayarit, which, when we think about the Nayarit, we can think of this restaurant that became a staple in the community of Echo Park, and that it nourished a community of Mexican immigrants, embedded them with a sense of belonging, and as they made their own places in Los Angeles. So we'll talk much more about this book, but first I just want us to give Natalia a very warm welcome to this event and for us to talk about your book.
Thank you. As you said, thank you to Tia Chuchas for hosting. I was fortunate to be on a panel when I launched the book with Luis Rodriguez at the LA Times Book Festival, and my family kept saying, still till probably last week, always say, that guy was so cool. He was so down to earth, right? Because it's great to write books, but if you can't connect with people, then what are they for? So thank you to Tia Chuchas for hosting us and being a place that connects with people. I write about urban anchors in the book, and I really feel that that's what this kind of bookstore is for a community. And I also want to thank Jorge. As he mentioned, he was my former student. That's not why I invited him to serve as my interlocutor today. Jorge also is a scholar of cultural history, of Latino studies, who is very interested in placemaking and the role that people have in shaping their communities. And if you look at Los Angeles, people talk about, it means something different to be Latino in LA versus New York versus Miami versus San Antonio. But it means something different to be Latino in different parts of LA. The Valley, East LA, Boyle Heights, Echo Park, Southeast LA, which Jorge writes about. I also was excited to have Jorge be the one that interviews me, because this book is really trying to gear itself to a public audience. I really hope teachers, K through 12, college professors pick it up and use it as a template for designing assignments so that their students can also create their own histories of urban anchors, their own social cultural maps of where they live. And that's already what Jorge does with his students. One of his fortes is doing public history, public scholarship. He's done it before through museums, through being a journalist, through Rock en Español archives, through his social media, and now he recently received a very prestigious grant through the National Endowment for the Humanities. So I'm very fortunate that I've been able to be in conversation with Jorge for many years now and for many years to come. So thank you, Jorge.
No, thank you, Natalia. I'm already blushing, as you can see. And thinking about this book, I am very honored to have seen the progression of the book. But one thing that I really like about this book is the progression of your scholarship, and how in the first book, Fit to be Citizens, you look at the ideas of how race shape public health policies, and also how those policies were enacted on populations such as the Mexican immigrants, Japanese, Chinese immigrants in Los Angeles. That's the first third of the 20th century. With your second book, you thought about the concept of racial scripts and how these are created and deployed relational to different racialized groups. And that covers a more national scope. And also, we can think of, if you did the first third of the 20th century, the second one goes all the way to the middle and to the last third of the 20th century. And in this book, not only you're deploying those similar lenses of query to think of how racialized populations strive for belonging in the U.S., how they're treated in the U.S., but this also is part of your, is looking at the lens through your personal history of your family. So I wanted to ask you, from researching archives, researching the histories of the lived experience of people in the past, to now coming to your own history, your own family history, in a neighborhood that you grew up, such as Echo Park. How do you come to this research as an academic, and what were the challenges? Because we know that sometimes we academics are made to think that we need to study something in isolation and also in being removed from our own lived experiences. So that's, for me, that has always been something I see that you have managed, that challenge you have managed to address it. But how do you first come out for this research and the challenges that is presented to you?
Well, thank you for laying out that question so carefully. So if you look at my first book, Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race, it is, as you said, a study of how race is shaped by public health departments, scientists, doctors, and how those ideas shape Los Angeles. But for me, it's still a personal book in the sense that when I was growing up and looking around LA and I would compare it to what I would see on television of what LA was supposed to look like, I think, that's not my LA. Why does my LA look so different? Why is the investment in a part of Los Angeles where I'm growing up in Echo Park different than Beverly Hills when I drive through there when I go to UCLA? And it was through that book that I was able to answer that question that I had for years. The second book, How Race is Made in America, looks at that race is what I call a relational concept that says, what it means to be Latino is also shaped by what it's not black, not white, not Asian, but that those groups and the way that people think about them and the ideas, the policies that are directed at them shapes what it means to be Latino. And that had so much to do with growing up in Echo Park and seeing that there was a similarity across the groups. My brother's best friend was a Vietnamese refugee. My best friend was Mexican, Irish. The kids in the neighborhood were working class whites, Filipino, Chinese, LGBTQ community there. So there were differences, but there was a commonality in terms of being working class, in terms of living in an area that people stigmatized. And so, while I answer that question through immigration law, it's really answering my question about Echo Park. And so when it came to this book, it was still a little bit about looking at, I still haven't seen this story reflected in what we teach, right? Both Jorge and I do a lot of teaching on cities, why cities look the way they do, why some parts of the city have more resources than other, why we place freeways and transportation systems in other places. And so I really wanted to answer that in terms of Echo Park. And I really wanted to answer, why is it that my experience of what it meant to be Latino growing up in Echo Park felt so different than my friends that I made it once I got to UCLA, and they'd say, oh, you know what it's like, growing up, you know what it's like being from like that neighborhood or, East LA. I'm like, I don't. It's very different to grow up in a multiracial, multi-ethnic neighborhood than it is in a predominantly ethnic enclave of one ethnicity. And so it was that story. And on top of that, I knew from my family that they were really interested in kind of claiming their piece of LA. The stories that I would read about segregation in LA, there are these things called redlining maps from the 1930s, but you still see a lot of the patterns from the 1930s because of the way the infrastructure was laid out around like where trees are planted, where a metro goes, housing values, all those kinds of things are still shaped from these designs from almost 100 years ago. And yet I knew from the Nayarit that there were stories of Mexican immigrants who would go to dinner and dress up and go to dinner in Santa Monica and go dancing. I knew there were stories of, gay waiters at the Nayarit who would go to Santa Monica on their day off. I knew there were stories of my grandmother saying, it's not enough that you work, you need to live and you need to understand Los Angeles. So on your day off, why don't you go dancing at the Palladium? Why don't you go out to dinner? Maybe it's only once a month, but try something different. And I knew that the archives never told those stories because the archives are shaped by the people who keep them, right? So they're the stories of the government that are tracking strikes. They're the stories of the government that are tracking strike workers. Even if they're the stories of the union, it's the people who get to show up to the meetings. It doesn't show you who stayed home and took care of the kids and, made dinner so that people, were there when they had something to eat when they were done with the meeting, or the people who took the notes. So there were a lot of women that were absent, children that were absent from these stories. And so I knew that this book, by telling the story through the lens of where the community met, a restaurant, we were able to get at the community as a whole and get at something that created community in ways that we usually only associate with official institutions like churches or schools or hospitals or libraries.
And these are stories that you think about and you were able to research through not only personal archives or oral histories, but also you did research transnationally. You went to Mexico to look at newspapers from Acaponeta, right? The town where your grandma migrates from. So all of this encompasses this term that you use, which is underdocumented stories, and also underdocumented. You're looking at underdocumented Los Angeles. When we think of LA history, we might think of the aqueduct, or we might think of when the Dodger Stadium was built, or Hollywood, right? But these are these everyday histories that create LA. So I wanted for you to tell us a little bit about this concept, underdocumented histories, and also what do we gain when we look at this underdocumented histories?
So, we tend to talk about undocumented, and we understand that undocumented don't have rights, must often live in the shadows, may not travel because they can't cross the border easily, cannot get on a plane. There's all these ways in which your life is circumscribed. And then we tend to think about people that are documented as kind of being polar opposite. But what I was finding in so much of my research is that, my grandmother was documented in part because she came at a point where documented meant something really different. She didn't have to have the same kind of documentation. It was easier to get a green card, which she could see when the laws were changing and said, oh, I better do something about that. So, you know, when I say she's documented, it also is not that she came to the US in the right way. It's just that's the way that people did things at this time. And yet, even with the advantages she had, even with being a business owner, even with immigrating and helping over 100 Mexican immigrants, when she first arrived in LA, she knew no one. And when she first opened her businesses, she knew no one. So I would start with these little anemic timelines, which was the other reason it took me a while to decide to write the book, because they were like, arrived, 1921, 1938, maybe she opened a restaurant, or was she just working at one? There was a business license pulled. Name of the restaurant, who knows? I just know it had an awning. Then, you know, going to the Mormon temple in Utah on a family vacation, just we drove through and we went, and finding census records, seeing that she was in the 1930 census. And this was before really Ancestry.com and all that. And asking my mom, like, wow, she's in the census. It says she was married before. My mom said, oh yeah, we don't talk about that. Oh, so, you know, there are these silences that families also have that you don't even know to ask. And then there are silences people don't even know they have. So I said, you know, the story was always that she married my grandfather to adopt you and your brother, but actually, the 1930 census says she was already married and living with him. She said, I didn't know that. So there were a lot of challenges, and so I really wanted to say underdocumented to really show that it's not as easy as like, I think you should go look up that record in Ancestry.com and go have a conversation with your abuela, and you too can write your own version of a place at the Nayarit, right? It's that there's a politics to the knowledge that immigrants are allowed to have. And so I think, you know, what the significance of that is, one, just exposing why those silences exist, that certain neighborhoods get razed, that certain records get erased, that there are pain and suffering in people's stories that people can't always talk about. That, you know, one of the books that I looked at for oral histories, the author talks about, and this is Lazy Abrego in UCLA, who looks at Salvadorian histories, and she does oral interviews of people that immigrated in the 80s, and she's talking to this one man, and she realizes that what's probably going on is that he's gay, and he doesn't want to talk about it, and she wants to get the interview, and she also doesn't want to, you know, step on any toes, so she changes the topic. But because of these taboos we have, even when we have an oral interview, there are silences. So it's a way of really trying to show how archives are structured in inequalities. There's the silences that we know about and the silences that we don't, and to kind of lay out those minefields as people try to recreate their own histories.
And that is really potent for Los Angeles, for LA history, being an LA historian myself, right? And I'm thinking of how you were able to recover some of those family histories, but in the process, you also came across these larger connections to place, to what's happening in not only in Echo Park, but all these different restaurants, to these different communities, of connecting to those larger LA histories. So I just wanted to ask you, what are some aspects or moments of LA history that, in your opinion, are still underdocumented that you came across in your writing that also, should learn more about?
I mean, I think there are small moments, right? Like, one is that a handful of the people that worked at the restaurant went on to open their own restaurant and to be their own urban anchors. And I've seen it a little bit more where you go to a restaurant's website and they say our history, and they might have a photo and they might have a few sentences. But I really do hope that people start writing those histories because they're fascinating. I'm going to get interviewed by Gustavo Arellano from the LA Times, and he said, where can we meet? I'm like, let's meet at a restaurant, because if we're going to talk about this, and let's meet at an urban anchor, let's meet at La Abeja in Highland Park, and let's ask Rogelio his story, because all those stories are different, right? So there are those kinds of things that I want people to get out of it. some of the parts are small, but they're the ones that stay with me. So one is, there was a waiter at the restaurant named Carlos Borras, and a lot of the people at the restaurant would leave to go to different parts of LA, especially if it meant nurturing other parts of their identity. As I mentioned, the gay employees. And Carlos was gay, but he tended to stay in Echo Park. And he would walk from one restaurant to the other. He would walk home there, and the person that interviewed said all he needed was Sunset Boulevard. And I just love that idea of the way that people live their lives, kind of in their, whether it's their 6 block, if they mainly walk, or 6 mile radius of LA. LA is such a city of many neighborhoods, many communities in that way. And I would love for us to have these maps of how immigrants use their space, not just how city planners design that, whether it's with QR codes, whether it's with Instagram, whether it's with newsletters that people write, however that is, but really getting a sense of people's ownership of a space.
And the belonging, right, that you discussed so eloquently on this term that you used, the urban anchors that you just said. And that could be a restaurant, but it could also be a whole block, right? And even temporalities, right? Walking at night for someone who's queer might be very different, or it's either more safe or it's less safe. I mean, they know the temporalities of the place, right? But here I'm thinking of this concept that you have, urban anchors, because of thinking of them as this very important contemporary but also historic place. And when we think of historical places, we think of sites of battles, right? Or monuments. Also like buildings, big buildings, expensive buildings, as those are historical sites. Or places where perhaps a meeting happened, a protest happened. But for you, in this book, you really help us think that places such as a restaurant, a bookstore such as Tia Chuchas are urban anchors that are both historic and also everyday that we can continue to use. Can you speak a little bit more about what for you an urban anchor is and what the Nayarit was? And even to this day, the Nayarit continues to be an urban anchor in its own. Obviously with a different clientele and different purpose, right? But can you tell us about the term and also the Nayarit as an urban, and the other restaurants, El Bate, El Chavo, and others?
Sure, so I hinted at this a little bit, just that usually when we study cities, when we look at like important landmarks that you would put on a map and that are central to a community, to a city, you're looking at places that we think of as official institutions, such as a library, a school, a church. And what we don't get from that is the way that community businesses, community spaces, whether it be a public space like a part of the park where people play dominoes or do their Tai Chi, whether it be a cafe or a bar or a bookstore, or in this case, a restaurant, are also really important to communities. And one might say, well, I understand how a park is, and a park might be actually a better urban anchor because it's a public space. Everyone has access to it, and a restaurant doesn't. But in this case, what we see, and I imagine people in places like the Achuchas, an urban anchor is a place that's designed for a community. Even though a place is public, doesn't mean that people necessarily feel comfortable in that public space. And easily through the 1960s when it was legal, and then for a long time afterwards, and many might say now even, public space was not about unfettered access. You think about even in places like Los Angeles, not just the South, schools, churches, parks, they were segregated, and Mexicans experienced that segregation. I gave a talk at the Autry, and when I was signing books afterwards, one of the men came up to me in line and said, you talked about how some spaces were segregated, including pools. My dad experienced that. My dad worked at Simon's Brickyard, which was a brick making company in Montebello that they had a company town attached to better surveil their workers and where they overcharged them for things at the market that they offered them. And he said he worked there, and so they liked to go to the public pool, but they could only go the day before it was drained. And so they would cover themselves in the brick dust because they knew when they jumped in the pool, they would dirty the pool. And they wanted to be like, thin, you know, it's just like, if you're gonna discriminate against us, we're gonna get back at you. And so, you know, these urban anchors are a place where people can feel seen. It's a place where you don't have to go and feel like, oh, I can't speak in Spanish, I must make myself small. It's a place kind of where you could live your whole life.
And what I really like about Nayarit as an urban anchor, it is the multitude of people that came in. In your book, you talk about Hollywood stars coming in, everyday people, Nayaritas, but also other people from Mexico, other people from folks from Latin America, in particular, baseball players. And I want to talk about this a bit because, in case you don't know, Natalia is a lifelong Dodger fan. When I was doing my PhD in San Diego and she was teaching and living in San Diego, there were times that she would drive up the 5 for those big games. Now it's a lot closer to you, which is great. And so I want to ask, as I was reading the book, I saw some of those episodes of baseball players. Your book is blurred by none other than Jaime Jarrin, right? So I wanted to ask you, how does the history of an urban anchor like in Nayarit intersect with the Dodgers and also other sports like boxing? And what does that tell us about this? What does that tell us about the Nayarit as an urban anchor?
So the Nayarit, as you mentioned the word that temporality earlier, and so the Nayarit was a place that appealed to different people at different times of day and according to their needs. So, you know, it opened a little bit later, so it didn't really have a breakfast crowd, but by lunch it was really going, and you know, you might have white collar workers there from downtown. After work, you might have workers come by who just want to get a beer and a quick bite. But we have to remember this is the 50s and 60s, so the Mexican population, the Latino population is mainly a Mexican population, and it's mainly a male population. So men that would come by just for a quick meal on their way home from work, maybe again stop for a beer. And then in the evening, since it was open till 4 in the morning, which is still hard for me to believe that my mother would work that late, since it was open that late, then people would come after, like the club had closed, make sure that they were, fortifying them, having some meal that soaked up all the alcohol that they may have had. So machaca was a very popular dish. Menudo was another very popular dish there. And my grandmother would attract people by both advertising on the radio. There was a very famous Mexican broadcaster, Martin Becerra, and he would advertise on his show. But on Saturdays, he would also advertise when he would host at the $1 Million Theater, where lots of acts would come through. For the Dodgers, it's not actually the Dodger players that are going there in the 60s, because the Dodgers have very few Latino players, but the Latino players from the other teams coming through towns would see it. And because it was near Dodger Stadium, because it had a neon sign, and because it had a name like the Nayarit that was so distinct, it really allowed people to kind of see it and say, oh, I'm curious as to what that is. Or I may not be from Nayarit, but I'm from Jalisco. Or I may not be from Nayarit, but I know it's coastal, and I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm from the Dominican, and I want to go eat at a place like that. And we also have to remember that a lot of those Latino players were dark-skinned. If they were to go out, they would pass as black. They would be seen as African American. And so they're opening themselves up to a layer of discrimination. And so coming to a place that's an urban anchor for immigrants also means that you can go, you can speak in Spanish, you don't fear being discriminated against, and that cannot, your layer of fame and fortune cannot protect you from that. And so they're still seeking out those kinds of places. And even movie stars like Marlon Brando, who, you know, many people thought was the, most talented actor, at least until his movie star did not do as well. But, you know, through the 50s and early 60s when he was going, he would, date Rita Moreno, he would be in interracial relationships and also might be discriminated against. So it really attracted people who were kind of on the margins.
And speaking of the richness of Echo Park at that time, now I want to go a little bit, in the decades after, right? Echo Park, Silver Lake, they become this kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial enclaves, bohemian in some way, right? With artists, intellectuals, and also a lot of very interesting mix of folks and a big Latinx population. But as we know, a number of Central Mexican American and also Black neighborhoods in the past now 2-3 decades have been gentrified. And you saw the process firsthand growing up or coming of age. And many of the longtime residents of color and also their businesses have been forced to move out of those areas. So just thinking of how these urban anchors were so pivotal to create a sense of belonging, for folks to understand a place for a hospital place, perhaps in a city that otherwise might be hostile. When we see this process, when we see this process of gentrification or displacement, and we see restaurants closing down or moving away from those communities, what do we lose when we lose these urban anchors such as in Nayarit? And also, how can we, how does history, but also perhaps more us being more aware of their role in society in those communities, how can we use history to preserve those places?
And maybe we'll make this our last question so we could open it up. You've done a nice arc. Thank you, Jorge. I think that what the humanities teach us are that we need to connect with other people. And in order to do that, we need to know their stories. And so their stories as people, but their stories of where they come from, why place is important to them, why their neighborhoods matter. And so part of what gentrification does is it doesn't just erase the places, it erases their history. And so I learned that, part of the impetus for writing the book was around that. So I would come up to Los Angeles from San Diego, and I would go to a party or a bar, and I would meet somebody, and they'd say, "Oh, where are you staying while you're in LA? Echo Park." "Oh, at an Airbnb?" "No, people live there. My family lives there," right? And there just kind of wasn't a connection with the rich history that was there. Or people would say, "Oh, you now have a Starbucks, you now have a Blue Bottle cafe, you now have these things. So now the neighborhood has these great places to eat or drink or go to," and it's like, it's always had that. So it's a way of by embracing that history, we're able to embrace that not only do the people that live there matter, but that the place matters. And those two stories are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. If you want to value people, you have to value where they came from. And in terms of how we do that, in terms of history, I mean, that's why we have professors like you, Professor Leal, right? We teach them, we teach our students about how to preserve those histories with whatever tool they're willing to do, whether it's graduate students writing a dissertation that becomes a book and teaching their own classes, or undergraduates that may do an oral interview with a local shopkeeper. You do it through your work with the Boyle Heights Museum, that is part of Josefina Lopez's theater, Casa 101, that you do research of the neighborhood, of histories that have passed there, and put it up on the walls of the theater, right? And it's not a huge space, but it's one that is available to the community. There's no charge to get in. People can walk by and come in. You also archive things online. And then Arabella Delgado has done a walking tour of Boyle Heights. So there's lots of things we can do, but we have to first know it's important and have some tools on how to do that.
No, definitely, and you have with this book, you have definitely helped us understand how important it is to share these histories that could start as family histories, but ultimately are part of LA histories, are part of the history of this nation, transnational histories. And so, I want to commend you for doing that, and also giving us some models that how we can do it, and then continue for us to all create our own family histories and our community histories. And also histories of these places, such as these urban anchors, such as the Achucha. So thank you, Natalia. And I think, yeah, definitely we should, I do have some questions that people send throughout the week,
Ooh.
but also we can combine them if there are questions on the people that are watching.
Yeah, so far there are no questions on the live stream, but we're open to have questions over here in the
Yeah, well, we can get started with a question here in the audience, and then I'll combine them with other questions. So. Not all at once.
I think my question is, how did this book evolve as you were kind of doing all this research from where you thought it was going to go to where it ended?
Painfully is the short answer. About painfully. I didn't want to write a book. I think for the reasons, like I said, I knew there were all these. I didn't have an archive, right? So I knew that it would be challenging. I knew there would be oral interviews. I knew I'd waited too long. Also, I got in the message early on, like many academics, that you don't write a personal history. I mean, that certainly wasn't going to be what I wrote for my first book if I was hoping to get tenure. And so many of the people had passed. As I mentioned, many of the waiters, other customers that were at the restaurant were gay. And with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, we lost many of them. I mean, Silver Lake, the landscape of Silver Lake just transformed during that time period. And so it started off as an article, but that first talk that I gave not far from here at Cal State Northridge, so many people went from Boyle Heights, from Echo Park, from Highland Park, and they said, no one's telling this history. And it wasn't just about that they wanted the specifics of their neighborhood, they just wanted to have a conversation that place matters, that neighborhood matters. I also knew from writing, just even the talk, I couldn't fit in everything I did find. And not just in terms of information, but in terms of concepts, in terms of questions. Part of the story is also the story of Nayarit in Mexico, and the way that people remain tethered to their communities. We're only seeing it more now, right? Like somebody just told me this morning at my gym that they're like, there's a Playas de Nayarit where they sell a pineapple or something. Have you heard of this? I'm like, is it carved out with shrimp in it? Yes, that's Nayarit. You just didn't have those kinds of regional that kind of regional specificity in cuisine before, because everything kind of had to be homogenized in order for it to attract a wider audience. And I think people are more now in the last few years claiming like, no, I want to have my nieve de Michoacán. I want to have the empanadas de camarón from Jalisco. I want these very specific things, And so the last part of the book was one on transnationalism. And so that section got longer, got shorter, because in the end, everything kind of has to be organized around why does place matter and how is a restaurant an example of that. And so while I may have a fascinating example of how one of the people that came to the Nayarit, it turns out, was the housekeeper for Dominique Dunn, who is Joan Didion's brother-in-law, that means there was a Nayarita babysitting the kids of this famous Hollywood couple, and my other former student, Alina, who was meeting with Jorge, and I was like, that's a wonderful story. That is not really the main connection to your book, and you need to cut it out. I was like, oh. So it's like every other piece of writing. You write it, you share it. You get feedback, you change it. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So that was kind of the evolution of it.
As you are all preparing your questions, I do have a question from Alina. So Alina is currently a professor in the University of Washington, and also one of your former grad students and a dear friend of mine, and she's watching us, and she sent this question with it. Yes. And so, and as Natalia has said, I mean, we met together as I was working on my dissertation, Alina was working on her dissertation, and Natalia, a general supporter us by giving us feedback and also by closing down coffee shops in San Diego as
I said we would close down bars, coffee bars.
That's how this book, the first version of the book happened, and my dissertation too. But Alina has a really good question that speaks to a bit of your how did this come about, and also the opportunities that are missed, right? Because sometimes we think that is not history, that's just my family story, right?
Yeah.
And she asked, if you had the opportunity to interview Natalia Molina, what would you ask her?
That is a great question. Alina knows more about my grandmother probably than some family members, because Alina did that first really deep dive into the El Eco newspaper in Nayarit. So thank you, Alina. And it was enough for us to kind of imagine her. I mean, I think one thing is how much of her decisions were purposeful and how much they're not. As a historian, you're trying to show how someone's story is unique or not unique in part of what's going on. So for example, the fact that she opened a restaurant, it's a nice story to tell in terms of like, she had some ganas, she had some immigrant chutzpah, you know? But to me, what's interesting is, was it really, how much did she know what she was up against? So was it that she kind of surveilled the landscape and said, what jobs are available to women? I'm going to be a seamstress. I'm going to be own a boarding house where I'll have to like cook and do everybody's laundry. I'm going to be a nanny or a housekeeper, or I'm going to work as a waitress. I will never get ahead in life that way. I want to open a restaurant. And so part of it is like, how much of those decisions were purposeful? And you know, of course, even if you ask someone, there's some things that you're looking at it from your perspective, so who knows what people would answer, right? Like, how much of why gay men work there, single women, divorced women, single moms, how much of why they work there was her purposely saying, I wish somebody had given me that chance. You know, so those kinds of things. But even if I ask someone that, I don't know that you'll necessarily get the answer, because everybody is seeing life through their own perspective. And I'm seeing it as a historian who wants to see how an individual story is a refraction of society.
No, it's a really interesting question, and continues to think of how we can get different answers through the way we analyze the information that we have. What questions do we have here in the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering how was the process of balancing a really personal family story and kind of going into it through like an academic lens. I'm wondering how that process was like, if there was like any clashes or if there was any moments where they intertwined nicely. I don't know if you had any thoughts on those.
Yeah, thank you. So there was a clash there, because I do tend to think of, even the way I answered his question, right? I'm always like, how can I make people care about this story? And part of it is, as academics, we are trained to tell a story that's in conversation with other stories that have been told. So even if you tell the story of something like, Always Running, Luis Rodriguez's memoir, right? He's talking about gang culture, East LA, this and that. So as a historian, that story would be like, yeah, but what produced the conditions for gangs in East LA? Well, I can tell you the way that people were over-policed. Gustavo Arellano just had this article in the LA Times about the Sleepy Lagoon case and the way that Mexicans were criminalized. So I can tell you that that moment of his experience wasn't just about him, but it was about decades of Mexican Chicano boys and men being stereotyped. And so there was little choice in, kind of what he had to navigate, where he was able to do, right? that's very different than a memoir. And so when I was writing this book, it was during the pandemic that I was finishing it up, and I turned it into my publisher, and he said, you know, do you want to try it once more with a few more personal stories? And you know, I was paired with an editor who would say, can you talk a little bit about this? And I'd say, nope, I don't have the information, right? Like, I need a piece of evidence. And she's like, can you talk about why you don't have the information? Oh, of course, because archives aren't kept in this way. And, you know, there we go. Can you talk about the first day that she opened the restaurant? No, I cannot. There were no witnesses there. Okay, can you talk about what other days were like that other people told you about? And so it was just a way of storytelling that I think that academics aren't usually trained to do. And yet, when we get together, what do we do but tell stories? That's the most human thing to do. That's how we connect with one another. Thank you.
Yes, Gabriela.
Definitely. I think your book is really interesting in a way. I love how you're able to read it, whether it be in an academic setting, outside an academic setting. I like how accessible it is to read. And I think it's really interesting that it's your own personal history. You're including that while also teaching other lessons and connecting it to your past work. And I think that's really interesting. So for anyone who's interested in going through their own family history or personal history to achieve the same goal you did with this book, what is one piece of advice you give to somebody doing that work?
Start now. Start right now. You know, don't let messages about not telling your story shape you. If you think you want to do something, do it. You know, our job is not to decide who will receive it and how it will be received. Our job is to create. Our job is to tell our story. After that, it's out of our hands. So, you know, with this book, it was like, we'll see what happens, right? But I wish somebody had asked me in an interview when I was finishing up the book, or maybe a couple years before I finished, like, did you ever think of writing this book? And I've been asked this question in interviews, and I always say no. I not only do I say, I sincerely believe no. I never thought of writing this book because when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and I took a Latin American Studies class, and there were a bunch of machistas in the class, and the professor told us, you all may one day want to go to grad school and be professors, but you will never be Latin Americanists because you are too close to the subject matter. And you know, we wrote a letter, we petitioned, it was this whole thing. But I think, you know, to some degree you internalize those messages. And part of it is also because, right, you're trying to show you're objective, you have some distance, these kinds of things. But it's kind of also no surprise then that my first book is about medical racialization and public health and objectivity, right? It's a very serious subject. And then the other day, last weekend I went to an 80s party. From a woman in my high school had an 80s party. That's when we graduated. The very end of the 80s, I will say. And she wanted a headshot of us. She was going to do these cute little buttons. And she said, can you send me one? And all that stuff's at my mom's house. So I had things in boxes, and I was looking through them. And I had this archive from grad school. Whenever people would send me letters or cards, I would keep them. And it's a really interesting kind of moment in time. And in there is a timeline of the Nayarit. It's when my grandmother immigrated. It's when she opened the restaurant. It's the name of my mother's biological mom because she died during the Depression of tuberculosis, which is why my grandmother adopted her and her brother. It even has my mom's biological mom's last name, which I don't think my mom knows anymore. And so if I would ask my mom, she wouldn't even know anymore. You know, my mom's 89. It was this timeline. Why else would I have written it unless I had thought of writing that history? And so it may have been, I didn't have the tools yet as a historian. It may have been for like a graduate seminar paper. But I clearly have wanted to tell this story for a long time. And I think that's the other disservice we do of training graduate students to only write as academics and not write as public scholars to not write op-eds, to not write blogs, to not just write in a diary for themselves and keep a journal, whatever it may be, because you can tell stories in lots of ways. Not everything has to become a journal article in an academic, right? You can connect with people in a lot of ways. You can do it through your poetry. You can come here and do open mic. You can do it through your art, and then when people ask you why you did that piece, you tell them. So that would be my biggest piece of advice. Start collecting those stories, worry about the mechanics of it later. The main thing is your voice, the main thing is your confianza, the main thing is knowing that your opinion matters most.
We have a question from Diego Antonio Paya on Facebook, who says, when discussing how to preserve the history of community, how can one begin to practice reimagining the community they have grown up in and or appreciate value its current and past history? Asking for clarity and advice, second generation Chicano from Covina, California. Tuned in from San Gabriel Valley. Thank you.
I love the identifiers of place. I'd like to hear your take on this question too.
And just, I mean, you're thinking of the answer. Yeah, Diego is a recent UCR grad. So.
Interesting. I think so. This is the one thing about being apart is I think there's a backstory there that I'm not knowing about Diego, right? So, what I'm thinking in terms of appreciating it and reconnecting, I do think that there is something about knowing how people come to be, how places come to be, so that we can understand them in their complexity, and maybe not always accept them. And what I mean by accept is, just kind of be like, okay, that's the way it is. But accept, oh, that's why they're complicated, and that's why they rub up against different communities in ways that aren't always productive. I'm sensing there's why is my community this way, and it's not always a nurturing place kind of thing. Or not a place where everybody can be their whole selves. And so part of it is understanding those, when you think of kind of like wagon wheels and the way that they leave like a mark in the landscape, or like, I'm a Western historian, I was just talking to somebody about wagon wheels, or a bike in a dirt path in the mountains. It's the same thing with our histories, and people tend to go to that easier part and follow the same path. So what were those paths that led people to form their communities the way they did, that perhaps left them less flexible or less willing to follow other paths? And then those people that do follow other paths face a lot of resistance. So part of it is that. Do you have another response? Or?
It's a really good question. And also, I mean, I think of, especially when we think of communities, groups that are marginalized, right? And how they create their own spaces. And I think for us historians is not think monolithically, or to think, oh yeah, this is the one community that tells the history of all the communities, but also think of, and in here I'm thinking of the conversations we had about Latinx queer communities in Los Angeles, and how sometimes we think that they may had a space or might not, but then the freeways were like the freeways allow them to go elsewhere and then come back. So maybe the community, their places were not created within the same community, but they still created community, and still were part of this larger group. Mm-hmm. So I guess my short, I think you put it perfectly in terms of like the ways that we leave behind, but also to think of how we can study even people that we can think of them as the margins and as part of the greater whole. And I do have, speaking of public, there's one question, and I'll go to this question after. Go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment more so as a response to the person and to Diego as well, because I haven't had the chance to read the book, but in college I also kind of studied like space or the occupation of space, right? My background was more in like cultural anthropology, right? And growing up in Pacoima, that influenced a lot of that, right? Like how my family like took up space in the area, right? Or communities historically. like more corporate companies, you know, that erases the history. It takes away like these local spaces or these, what do you call them? Urban
Anchors.
anchors, right?
That's what you will call her now too.
Yeah.
Love it. You'll be like, that was such a great term. I can't believe I didn't know it before.
Right. Yeah. So in that happening, right, it does remove a lot of these like local histories. But I think we often forget, or there's a lot of conversations online too, like supporting small businesses, right? Or like supporting this, but it's just like these businesses have been around this for years, right? There's still like a lot of urban anchors that have been here for decades, right? Theatrical being one of them. So like one thing that I've tried practicing, at least in that sense, is like also if the opportunity presents itself, like if it's not a busy day, let's say like at a restaurant, you know, like asking them like, or asking the owners or asking whoever works there, you know, like about the space, you know, and that allows for that like relationship to be built like between you as like a customer or like person who lives there locally, and also as like the person on the other end, right, like the owner of the space or like, you know, their perspective, you know, sometimes like if the time allows, you know, they'll sit down with you and talk to you, and like in solidifying that relationship, you know, it also like aids in that too, because then you yourself can like pass on those histories or like present that individual or like that those owners, you know, with that opportunity to reflect as well, right? And to preserve those histories or like allow oneself to like learn more about the community that you're either like living in or have grown up in or all of that too. So yeah, but I really appreciate all of that y'all have shared.
Oh, thank you. And maybe we'll make this the last question.
Yes, and
Right, 'cause
I think
know-
it's really, and if you have another question, we'll definitely take it. I'm thinking of, you know, the way that you are using urban anchors, and perhaps, you know, like you give us this great tool, this great concept that then we can deploy at, you know, like at the corner restaurant. And it might be the corner restaurant that, you know, maybe uses too much manteca, and you might not like the manteca, but then you'll find other something else, right?
Yeah.
And I say this because they don't have to be super pristine or Instagrammable. But they're urban anchors that sometimes we don't think of them. And I guess just being able to identify them as urban anchors. And so the question is by one emerging public historian practitioner, Daisy Herrera. She's a current grad student at UCR. And she's wondering if there's an idea or a plan to preserve the Nayarit or the Eco Building as a cultural space that you have, you know, like as you research and your book has now come out, if you have been approached by that, or how would you go about it?
I think that the way that those spaces are officially preserved are, you know, have all kinds of regulations that the building itself wouldn't meet. That being said, I would love it if, not just for this, but for, you know, lots of places that people could do kind of their own walking guides. Or one of our colleagues, Micah Mespa, just wrote a book on Chicago, Making Mexican Chicago. And he had posted on Twitter a leading activist and a QR code like on a bridge. And I was like, is that part of something? So it's one of the things I've been looking into, just so that people can kind of understand these things. There's a new article in the LA Times, I think maybe today, I don't know in what edition, but I saw it today. Mayor Garcetti has issued a call saying, you know, it's been the 150th anniversary of the massacre, Chinese massacre in downtown LA when Chinese were lynched by a white mob. And so there's a little bronze plaque commemorating it, but like most people, and I could tell even looking through this crowd, right, like most people have never heard of it. It's not what we're taught in our history books. There's not a big monument to it. And so they're soliciting ideas on how to deal with it. I haven't read the article yet. I was a little surprised because I was part of the Mayor's Civic Memory Commission, and we did a report past due. So for those of you that are interested in those kinds of things, you can Google, you know, LA Mayor past due. And we have all kinds of ideas of what to do to preserve these kinds of things. But part of it is there's also the Chinese Historical Society. And they've done walking tours, they've done things like on maps that you could give yourself the tour. There's so many ways to do this. It's more about making sure that the powers that be, that, you know, the big voices that push these messages out are able to to get the message out about these things.
And that's the ongoing, not only conversation, but the ongoing call to action for more of these histories to be shared and to be created and shared, with everyone, and that all of us, are learning about our histories, personal histories, community histories, place, and that we can share them, right? As you have eloquently done with this book and your overall work. So thank you so much, Natalia, for joining us today.
Thank you, and I hope I get to be your interlocutor when your book comes out, and we will come back here.
You gotta thank them now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Let's give a thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Also, thank you for folks joining us on the streaming.